Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr. This is episode 362 of CryptoBiography, and it's part one of the Orb Warmer. And here we go. Wake up. Susan opened her eyes. It was still dark out, being the middle of winter, but she knew her mother would wake her at the appropriate hour, 7 o'clock. Thanks. She took a moment, just a moment, for herself to wake up fully. Then she got out of bed. Susan thought about her birthday, which is going to be in just 2 weeks. She would be 28. She wished she could live on her own. She loved her parents, but it was past time she'd moved out on her own. But like everyone else who was an orb warmer, she just couldn't afford it. It took the incomes of her parents and her just to live in their cramped 3-person, 2-bedroom apartment. She ate a small breakfast of oatmeal. The one window in the dining area, the only room with a table, showed a gray sky, and not much else. Thanks, Mom. Love you, Dad. She gave each a quick kiss and headed to work. Her parents were also orb warmers, but for a different company. Her orbs, when imbued with power, went to the mages who kept the lights on. Her parents' orbs went to the mages who caused the crops to grow at their remarkable rate. She walked to the bus stop. There were about 7 people there, some of whom worked with her. They barely acknowledged each other with small nods. With nothing else to do, she watched the city roll by on the bus. It was powered by magic, orbs feeding power to the wheels. She liked how quiet it was, with only the sound of the wheels and the wind and a bit of hushed talk from some of the other passengers. Her mind drifted during the commute, but she had to focus for her orb warming. She entered a good-sized room with very little light, which she often thought was ironic since the orbs they warmed were used to light the streets and houses of the city. She sat down at her desk. The desk had a small hole cut into it, and in that hole sat a glass orb. She took a breath and then, just as a chime rang, began. Orb warming was not difficult, not exactly. Everyone could do it, and that was why the great majority of people now did do it as their work. The trick was in the effort. It took hours of quiet concentration to get an orb warmed up. The glass orb looked plain and clear when she started. After about 5 minutes of her touching and concentrating on the orb, it began to glow softly in the center. 10 minutes after that, and the glow was starting to become bright. Half an hour in, and the light was almost too bright to look at from this close. She closed her eyes. Something close to an hour, and she heard a voice say, calmly, near her, "Thank you." The bright, warmed orb was taken by Deborah, whose job it was to do this. She placed it in a cart, into a similar hole, though this was one of many in a row, covered it with a cloth, then took a dark orb and placed it in the hole for Susan. Susan took a breath, placed her hands on the new orb, and started focusing again. She managed to get 4 orbs warmed before lunch, something less than half of the workers managed to do. After lunch, the process repeated. The only difference was in the last hour when they were allowed to sing together. They sang songs of hope and dreams, quietly. Generally, it slowed down the orb warming process, which is why they were not allowed to sing throughout the day. But Susan didn't find that singing ever slowed her down. Most of the other women she sometimes spoke with seemed to think the same thing. But the rule was there, and so some people apparently were affected. At the end of the day, she was quite tired. Focusing all day was not an easy thing to do, even with her youth. She didn't know how her parents did it. They often looked exhausted when they came home at night. The bus home helped somewhat. When she got home, she started making dinner, as she invariably got home before her parents, and she always felt better when she made a meal for them. The meal, a bit of meat stretched into a melange of eggs and rice with some vegetables mixed in, was tasty, if not quite filling enough. They just couldn't afford to make the meals bigger than Susan made them. Susan had watched her parents grow thinner month by month, and now year by year. She too was becoming very thin, though not so much as her parents. Partly this was the vigor of youth. Partly this was because her parents insisted on using their nearly non-existent spare money on small gifts of food for her, which they refused to take any part of. Still, on most days, none of them noticed any of this. It was only once in a while that something shocked her into noticing how they were slowly being starved. This was one of those days. It happened when she was cleaning the cutting board after chopping the vegetables. There was one small window in the kitchen just above the sink. With the winter sun having gone down early, she could see her reflection in the glass. She had seen that her cheeks had inverted. She had always been a bit chubby-cheeked, even as she lost weight. But tonight, she really noticed that, for the first time, her cheekbones were jutting out over her cheeks, which were now flat. They ate mostly in silence. It didn't take long, with the small portions available. That matched the amount of conversations they had. Nothing worth talking about had happened to them, either. Still, when they were done, and her parents were staring blankly at the table over empty plates, she got up, cleared the plates, and washed the dishes. It was still gratitude. After dinner, there were a few hours, which they spent in silence. Susan had gotten tired of the few books they had, and knew better than to take in the constant non-news propaganda shows on the television. Instead, she went to her room and started writing. Some nights she wrote a diary, some nights she wrote poetry, and on a lot of nights she wrote long, ongoing sagas about people who didn't know they had it in them. She didn't know if anyone else would ever read any of them, but it made her happy, or at least less unhappy, so she kept at it, as she had now for years. On her next weekend, she went to the park. It was one of the things she could do that wouldn't cost any extra money. She watched children play with simple homemade balls, throwing or kicking them around. She watched old people, invariably thin, feeding birds or just taking slow strolls on the dark paths. Then she took a walk herself, going all through the park, enjoying the trees and the occasional bird or squirrel. In one large open area of the park, which was sometimes used for soccer matches, there were a lot of people setting up some tents. There wasn't a public activity there today that she'd heard of. She sat down in the shade of a tree and watched the proceedings. They got stranger as the tents continued to go up. And that's where we're ending the story for this week. Hope you're enjoying it. If you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, CryptoBiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook, at Mastodon, or Twitter, X. And thank you for listening. Words and music, copyright 2024, Brandon Starr, all rights reserved. Characters and events are fictional, fictionalized, or satirical.